My topic on risk communication, I think a lot of people should be asking why risk communication. And a bit unlike the previous presentations, but certainly built upon the previous presentations, this is something that I think is a key factor in moving forward. So what I'm about to present is a look forward to where we can go with a lot of the efforts that have been done to date. And pretty much each of my slides that I do have, you can drill very deep into those. So if there's ever any interest, just let me know. And if there's ever anything more that I can explain to help with that, I'd be happy to. Moving on to my second slide, the stoplight. Stoplight, to me, perfectly explains why risk communication is so important, because we all understand, as do workers, what a red light and a green light means. However, very often in workplaces, we're stuck with the yellow light effect, something that's not quite green or red. And just like us, workers react very differently to yellow light, just depending on their own opinions. So some of us will stop every time. Some people go every time. Some people will assess the traffic and decide whether or not they should go through the yellow light. Or some people just check for the police. And on a lot of different sites, I'm sure where most of us work, people who do environmental health and safety support are seen as the police. The next slide is the very common risk matrix that we've used for our risk level approach to environmental safety and health. So what the risk level approach does is very simply divides the risk level 2 and 3, the yellow light, into 2, much closer to green, and that's a great place to be as risk level 2. It means you understand the controls moving forward, but there is the potential for exposure. And risk level 3, which is often seen as orange, and risk level 3 is closer to red, and you need more assistance when you're getting into those levels. Moving to the next slide is talking about how we look at the risk level based management system. So this is an occupational risk management process using risk levels. It's now been expanded into environmental and occupational risk management, which is a unique opportunity based on risk communication. On the left hand of the slide, you see what is a typical risk level breakdown on a given work site, where about 10% of the risks are at the highest level, risk level 4, and approximately half are at the lowest level, risk level 1. However, as most of us do have, is the regulatory oversight that tends to follow us, certainly in developed countries. We have very often an even level of oversight for what is considered something that's important to their environmental safety and health team. So risk level 1 and risk level 4 are not seen as any different. However, on the far right side, you see the ideal environmental safety and health model where you have the highest resources focused on the risk level 3 and risk level 4 efforts, and much less towards risk level 2 and 1. Moving to the next slide, we come back to the risk matrix, but in the regulatory environment, we have controls differently than a lot of control banding controls that some of you may be familiar with. Here, our controls from risk level 1 through risk level 4 are based on documentation. Documentation is really important for the areas we work to ensure we have our exposures controlled, and also to ensure we have documented what we have done to control those exposures. That process is going to be extremely important as we move forward into the talk. Moving on to the next slide is where we tie together the risk level based management system and our topic of risk communication. Because most important is for the workers to understand what they're doing on a given day. Once you know the risk level of a given task, all the risk communication flows. The workers understand what level of hazards are present, what controls are required, if PPE is necessary, what type of sign-off for documentation is necessary, is training necessary, is medical surveillance required? And most importantly, at the bottom of the list is whether or not they need to ask for help from an expert. Or as I like to say, if that line between risk level 2 and risk level 3, if you might be bumping up against risk level 3, just pick up a phone and ask for assistance. So control banding on the next slide. Some of you, I believe, are aware, it was something that was developed in the industrial hygiene or occupational hygiene world. And most of the efforts applied are in the control of chemical, physical, and biological exposures from the industrial or occupational hygiene field. What we've begun to do is apply it in a safety context as well. We've also done it for environmental, but I wanted to veer into the topic of construction. And for safety, a lot of us, when we do walk through a safety construction site, we'll have a checklist of items that are potential hazards and whether or not controls are in place. Looking at safety in the same model, the risk level based management system model, it is looking at risk level 3 hazards on this checklist that if you have the controls in place, then you have reduced it to a risk level 2. So now you have a system where the risk levels for what would be industrial hygiene also reach across into the industrial safety world. Moving to the next slide, you'll see a graph. There's a lot of information on that on the left-hand side, the pre-project hazard analysis checklist. But in essence, moving left to right, what you need to know is here we have a control banding model for construction projects, where on the far left side we have the pre-project hazard assessment checklist based on the different hazards that may be prevalent from both severity and probability on a construction site. We use the same risk level approach. The training level, the dividing line between risk level 2 and 3 here, is whether we have a general hazard awareness at risk level 2 for the workers who are working in the field, as opposed to risk level 3, a competent person or higher that will be necessary on that job site for certain tasks. And those control levels are the outcomes that the workers need to understand before the project begins. And the multidisciplinary approach that flows from this, from the communication within and between environmental health and safety professionals, is extremely important. But most importantly, as we move to the next slide, it's important to the workers. I use construction because it's at least 10% of the global workforce. It's responsible for at least 40% of occupational fatalities. In the small and medium-sized industries or enterprises globally, 80% of that work is done in the SMEs for construction. If you go to the informal sector, it's 90% and higher. 30% have some type of ergonomic or musculoskeletal disease and back pain. And here's the hard part. The simple solutions that are available could cause a reduction, according to ILO, of 83% less deaths. The cost of each of these incidents, just using the U.S. as an example, of $30,000 per incident, anytime you have anything construction related, it's double the costs in the U.S. So imagine the increased costs worldwide. But going back to the ILO statistic, the solutions, the controls have been known for over 100 years in this industry. The next slide. The next slide, if you look at the picture, that blue oval kind of covers the whole section of the world that Marianne referred to in her slide of where the developments internationally are according to the World Bank. Well, this is also the area of the world where you have 90% or higher of the world's workers that do not have anyone like us, like environmental health and safety professionals to support. And although my slide is now dated too, Marianne, 2.7 million deaths annually, that number keeps going up. But we're also looking at well over 160 million work-related diseases and now upwards of 300 million non-fatal injuries every year. So what we want to do is to address that area. So how does this all tie together? The next slide, what's in my toolbox today? This is all I want workers to understand. If you're looking at a construction site, we're professionals. We can look at it and see the hazards that they may be exposed to. How risky is it? And then the question is, how do we go about communicating the hazards and the risk? The next slide. the future vision for both risk level-based management and the environmental occupational risk management, as well as the documentation output of having this applied in many different sectors around the world, is the ability to take each of the professions and the hazards related to them on a construction site for safety, industrial hygiene, ergonomics, the environment, fire protection, and the project overall, and give each of those a risk level for the work that's being done. Once you have this information, you now have the ability to take the construction-related tasks and the related hazards and controls and directly lay them upon the type of work that's going on in developing countries. Next slide. There's one big problem, though. What we're doing before was communicating in English, and as I just recently learned, West Africa, as an example, is a region with hundreds of different languages. Plus, when you deal with the informal sector, you had to add high levels of illiteracy. So we need to be able to communicate all of this information without the words that we're used to. So for each of the professions, we can have symbols. Moving to the next slide. And for each of the risk levels, we can have color codes. So when the question goes back to the worker, what's in my toolbox today? Next slide. The worker can go to the project, the lead, can go to the project-related item and click on the button and be able to see, here profiled on a smartphone, the controls necessary for their workers on that site or for the worker themselves on the task that they're performing on any construction project anywhere in the world. Move to the next slide. And I say anywhere in the world because this is the type of risk communication we need to be able to have, because there aren't enough of us to go out there and do the work necessary to cover the well over 2.5 billion workers that will never see anyone like us. So we have to be able to communicate our expertise simply. And by doing it through risk communication, next slide, by using the smartphone, we're in a position where currently there are 2.5 billion smartphones that are used globally. By 2020 and moving on, there's forecasts for over 3 billion smartphones. Therefore, we do have a means to get our professional information in the simplest risk communication form to the workers and the projects that's necessary. On my final slide, that's why we talk about risk communication, because especially if we can do this without language, we'll have the ability to protect the more than 2.5 billion workers that will never meet anyone like us. And this, in whole purpose, is what Workplace Health Without Borders is about. And when you talk about a business plan, for some reason, occupational risk is something that's ignored internationally. But with this small fraction of investment, less than 1% that's given to environmental and other public health related issues, we can save millions of lives every year. Thank you very much.